I will not be your bride, your grace." The declaration echoed through Duke Ravenscroft's grand hall like a gunshot. In 1885, women didn't say no to a duke. But Elara Whitcombe was no ordinary woman. She had just rejected the most powerful man in London, a man many believed had killed his first wife. And now, standing before the fire in his darkened library, she realized this confrontation would either set her free or destroy her completely. What city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and hit that like button if you want to see how she survives. The gas lamps of Covent Garden Opera House flickered against the November darkness like 1,000 dying stars. Inside the gilded theater, London's elite sat arranged in their private boxes like pieces on a chessboard, each positioned according to rank, wealth, and scandal. The air hung heavy with French perfume, burning candle wax, and the suffocating weight of expectations that pressed down on every soul in attendance. Elara Whitcombe sat in the Whitcombe family box, her emerald silk gown a deliberate choice, too bold, too bright, exactly the kind of thing her mother had begged her not to wear. She watched the soprano on stage struggle through Verdi's La Traviata and fought the urge to critique the woman's technique out loud. "You're doing it again," her cousin Margaret whispered, elbowing her sharply in the ribs. "Doing what?" Elara asked innocently, though she knew exactly what Margaret meant. "That face. The one that says you'd rather be anywhere else on earth than here." Elara allowed herself a small smile. Margaret wasn't wrong. At 26 years old, Elara had long passed the age when most women of her station had secured husbands and begun producing heirs. Instead, she had spent the last 8 years reading philosophy, studying forbidden anatomy texts smuggled from her physician uncle's library, and systematically rejecting every marriage proposal that came her way. 7 proposals, 7 rejections, 7 scandalized families. Her father, Sir Charles Whitcombe, had stopped trying to control her after she'd publicly debated a member of Parliament on women's suffrage at a dinner party, reducing the man to apoplectic rage. Her mother had taken to her bed with nervous exhaustion for an entire month. But neither parent could truly disown her. She was their only child, and the Whitcombe name, though respectable, needed her eventual marriage to maintain its standing in society. "I'm simply observing," Elara murmured. "The soprano has excellent technical skill, but no emotional authenticity. She's performing grief without feeling it." "And you're performing propriety without feeling it," Margaret shot back with a knowing grin. "At least try to look less like you're planning an escape route." Elara was about to respond when she felt it, that distinct pressure at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She'd learned to trust that instinct. In a world where women were constantly observed, judged, and cataloged like specimens in a museum, one developed a sixth sense for when observation crossed from casual to focused. She turned her head slowly, scanning the boxes across the theater, and there he was. Duke Adrian Ravenscroft sat in the largest private box, positioned at the perfect angle to see both the stage and the entire audience. While everyone else watched the performance, he was watching her. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She'd never met the Duke personally, but everyone in London knew of him. 34 years old, impossibly wealthy, holder of one of England's oldest and most prestigious titles, and wrapped in scandal so thick it followed him like a shadow. 3 years ago, his young wife, Catherine, had died under mysterious circumstances at his remote Yorkshire estate. She'd been 5 months pregnant. The official report stated she'd fallen down the grand staircase during a violent storm, but London society whispered much darker theories. Some said she'd thrown herself from a tower window in complete despair. Others claimed the Duke's cold, controlling temperament had driven her to madness. A few brave souls dared suggest he'd pushed her himself, eliminating both wife and unborn child in one brutal act. No charges had ever been filed. No investigation had been conducted beyond a perfunctory inquest. The Duke had the kind of power and connections that made inconvenient questions disappear. He'd retreated to his Yorkshire estate for 2 years of mourning, or hiding, depending on who told the story. When he finally returned to London 6 months ago, he was treated with a peculiar mixture of deference and fear. No one wanted to cross a man of his power, but neither did anyone want to get too close to potential danger. And now he was staring directly at her. Elara met his gaze without flinching. It was considered improper for a woman to hold eye contact with a man she hadn't been formally introduced to, especially across a public venue. The correct behavior would be to lower her eyes demurely, perhaps blush, certainly look away. Elara did none of those things. Instead, she raised her chin slightly and stared back with deliberate challenge. If he wanted to watch her like some exotic creature in a menagerie, she would make sure he knew she saw him doing it. For a long moment, they held each other's gaze across the crowded theater. The soprano hit a particularly dramatic note. The audience stirred with polite appreciation. But in that private box across the way, the Duke's expression remained absolutely still, intense, focused, unreadable. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. More like acknowledgement, recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. Elara felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the opera house. "Elara," Margaret hissed urgently. "Stop staring at the Duke. People are noticing." "Let them notice," Elara said quietly, finally breaking eye contact to look at her cousin. "I'm not doing anything improper, simply watching the performance." "You were not watching the performance. You were locked in some kind of visual battle with the most dangerous man in London." Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "They say he murdered his wife, Elara. Actually murdered her, and you're sitting here challenging him like you're at a fencing match." "They say a lot of things," Elara replied. "Most of them invented by bored aristocrats with nothing better to do than destroy reputations. His wife died under suspicious circumstances. That's not invention. That's fact. Suspicious doesn't mean murder. It means unexplained." Elara kept her voice steady, though her heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit. "And from what I've read, the woman was trapped in a miserable marriage, isolated in a remote estate, with no friends, no freedom, and a husband who barely spoke to her. If anything tragic happened, the circumstances were suspicious long before her death." Margaret stared at her. "You've been reading about this?" "I read about everything." Elara smoothed her gloves with deliberate calm. "Knowledge is the only power women are truly allowed to possess, so I collect it whenever possible." The lights in the theater began to dim, signaling the end of the first act. Around them, people stirred, preparing to step out into the lobby for intermission. The real purpose of attending the opera, where social hierarchies were negotiated and reputations made or destroyed over champagne and carefully worded gossip. "Come," Margaret said, standing and adjusting her shawl. "We should circulate before your mother sends a search party." Elara rose reluctantly, knowing Margaret was right. Her mother had specific expectations for evenings like this. Be seen, be admired from a distance, engage in appropriate conversation with appropriate people. Don't cause a scene, don't say anything too intelligent or too controversial. Don't remind anyone that you're educated enough to have opinions of your own. Be decorative, be forgettable, be safe. Elara had never been good at any of those things. They descended from the box into the grand lobby, where London's elite gathered in clusters like birds arranging themselves according to pecking order. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across silk gowns and starched collars. Servants circulated with trays of champagne. Conversations hummed with the particular energy of people saying nothing while communicating everything. Elara accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant and positioned herself near one of the tall windows overlooking the gas-lit street. From here, she could observe without being forced into tedious small talk. "Miss Whitcombe?" The voice came from directly behind her, deep, controlled, with the kind of aristocratic accent that came from centuries of breeding and expensive education. Elara turned slowly, though she already knew who she'd find. Duke Adrian Ravenscroft stood less than 3 feet away, holding a glass of whiskey and watching her with the same focused intensity she'd noticed from across the theater. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd expected. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored evening coat. Dark hair swept back from a face that was handsome in a severe, aristocratic way. Sharp cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes so dark they appeared almost black in the lamplight. And those eyes, they looked at her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve, whether she cooperated or not. "Your Grace," Elara said, executing a curtsy that was technically correct but deliberately minimal. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "We haven't." He didn't apologize for the breach of etiquette. "I'm correcting that oversight now." "How very direct of you." "I find directness saves considerable time." He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving her face. You were staring at me during the performance. You were staring at me first, Elara countered. The corner of his mouth twitched. So I was. Does that bother you? Should it? Most women would find it uncomfortable, improper. I'm not most women, Your Grace. No, he said quietly. I don't believe you are. Around them, conversations had started to falter as people noticed the Duke speaking to Elara Whitcombe. Heads turned. Whispers began to circulate like poison through water. Elara could practically hear the gossip forming. The spinster Whitcombe girl and the Duke who killed his wife. How utterly scandalous. How completely inappropriate. You're causing a scene, Elara observed, keeping her voice light. People are staring. Let them stare. He set his glass down on a nearby table with careful precision. I'd like to call on you tomorrow afternoon, 2:00. Will you be at home? The directness of it took her breath away. No polite preliminaries, no coy dancing around the request. Just a straightforward statement of intent. That's remarkably presumptuous, Your Grace. Is it? He tilted his head slightly, studying her. You strike me as a woman who values honesty over empty courtesy. So I'm being honest. I find you interesting. I want to know more. Will you receive me or not? Elara should have said no. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to refuse this dangerous man with his dark reputation and intense stare. She should have made a polite excuse, retreated to safety, avoided whatever this was before it could begin. Instead, she found herself saying, 2:00, the Whitcombe residence on Belgrave Square. Don't be late. Something flashed in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or satisfaction. I'm never late, Miss Whitcombe. Then I suppose we'll see if you're a man of your word. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his severe features into something almost warm. I suppose you will. He bowed, a gesture of respect that felt somehow more personal than the formal etiquette required, and walked away, cutting through the crowd with the kind of confidence that came from knowing people would move out of his way. Elara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What? Margaret hissed, materializing at her elbow. In the name of all that is holy, was that? A conversation, Elara said calmly, though her hands were trembling slightly around her champagne glass. That was not a conversation. That was... I don't even know what that was. Margaret's eyes were wide with alarm. Elara, you cannot receive him. You absolutely cannot. The scandal alone would what? Ruin me? Elara laughed without humor. Margaret, I'm already ruined by every standard that matters. I'm 26, unmarried, too educated, too opinionated, and too stubborn to pretend otherwise. My reputation can't sink much lower. It can always sink lower, Margaret said grimly. And the Duke is exactly the kind of man who could drag you down to depths you haven't imagined. They say he's dangerous, Elara, truly dangerous. They say a lot of things. And sometimes, Margaret said quietly, what they say is true. Elara didn't answer. She couldn't, because somewhere deep in her bones she knew Margaret was right. The Duke was dangerous. She'd felt it in the way he looked at her, in the controlled intensity of every word he'd spoken. But here was the truth she couldn't explain, even to herself. She was tired of being safe, tired of living a half-life bounded by other people's expectations and fears, tired of watching her years slip away while she waited for something, anything, to break the suffocating monotony of a world that had no place for women like her. If Adrian Ravenscroft was dangerous, then perhaps danger was exactly what she needed. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispered conversations and curious stares. News of the Duke's approach had spread through the opera house like wildfire, and Elara found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from every angle. Some looks held pity. Poor foolish girl, doesn't she know what she's risking? Others held envy. How did she catch his attention? A few held outright hostility. Who does she think she is? Elara endured it all with her head high and her expression serene, giving them nothing to feed on beyond the bare facts of what had happened. When they finally returned home to Belgrave Square near midnight, Elara's mother was waiting in the drawing room, still dressed in her opera finery, a glass of sherry clutched in her trembling hand. Elara! Lady Whitcombe's voice was tight with barely controlled hysteria. Is it true? Did the Duke of Ravenscroft actually speak to you tonight? He did. Elara began removing her gloves with deliberate calm. And is it true that he asked to call on you? Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Lady Whitcombe made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. This is a disaster, an absolute disaster. Really, Mother? A duke wishes to call on your unmarried daughter, and you consider it a disaster? Not just any duke. Lady Whitcombe set her sherry down so hard the liquid sloshed over the rim. The duke whose wife died under suspicious circumstances. The duke whom half of London believes is a murderer. That duke! Half of London believes many foolish things, Elara said quietly. That doesn't make them true. You cannot receive him. I absolutely forbid it. I'm 26 years old, Mother. You can't forbid me anything. Charles! Lady Whitcombe called toward the study where Elara's father had retreated. Charles, come here at once! Your daughter has lost her mind. Sir Charles Whitcombe emerged from his study, still in his evening clothes, looking exhausted. At 62, he'd long ago given up trying to control his headstrong daughter. What's she done now? She's agreed to receive the Duke of Ravenscroft tomorrow. The Duke of Ravenscroft, Charles. The man everyone says— I know what everyone says, Sir Charles interrupted wearily. He looked at Elara with something that might have been resignation or respect. She could never quite tell which. Is this what you want, girl? To invite that kind of attention? I want, Elara said carefully, to make my own choices, even if they're mistakes. They'll crucify you if anything happens. The gossip alone could destroy whatever small hope you have of a decent marriage. I have no hope of a decent marriage by their standards, Elara replied. I gave up that hope years ago when I realized I'd rather have freedom and loneliness than bondage and companionship. Sir Charles studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he sighed and nodded. Very well, receive him if you wish. But be careful, Elara. Some men are dangerous in ways you can't prepare for. Charles! Lady Whitcombe's voice rose to a near shriek. You cannot possibly be allowing this. I'm not allowing anything, Sir Charles said tiredly. I'm simply acknowledging reality. Our daughter makes her own choices. She always has. He returned to his study and closed the door firmly behind him. Lady Whitcombe stared at Elara with an expression of betrayed horror. You'll regret this. When the scandal becomes unbearable, when no decent family will receive you, when you're completely ruined, you'll regret this moment. Perhaps, Elara said softly, but at least it will be my regret, Mother. My choice. My life. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, leaving her mother weeping delicately into her sherry. In her room, Elara dismissed her lady's maid and stood at the window, looking out over the dark streets of Belgrave Square. Gas lamps flickered in the fog. A few carriages rumbled past, carrying London's elite home from their evening entertainments. She thought about the Duke, about the intensity in his eyes, the directness of his speech, the way he'd looked at her like she was something worth studying rather than something to be dismissed or controlled. And she thought about the dead wife, Catherine Ravenscroft, who died at 23, 5 months pregnant, fallen, or pushed, or jumped, down a staircase in the middle of a Yorkshire storm. What had her life been like? Had she been happy, even briefly? Or had she been trapped from the beginning, married to a man who could never love her, isolated in a remote estate with no escape? Elara pressed her hand against the cold window glass. Tomorrow, she would let the Duke into her home. She would look him in the eyes and try to see past the rumors and gossip to whatever truth lay beneath. And if what she found was dangerous, well, she'd chosen danger over safety the moment she'd agreed to receive him. The clock in the hall struck 1. Elara finally turned from the window and began preparing for bed, knowing that sleep would be difficult but necessary. Because tomorrow, everything would change. She just didn't know yet how much. The morning arrived gray and cold, with November rain beating against the windows like impatient fingers. Elara woke early despite her late night, her mind already racing with thoughts of the afternoon ahead. She took breakfast alone in the morning room. Her mother was still abed with her nerves, and her father had left early for his club, no doubt to escape the domestic drama. Elara was grateful for the solitude. It gave her time to think, to prepare, to steel herself for whatever conversation was coming. At 1:30, her lady's maid helped her dress in a gown of deep burgundy wool, elegant but not ostentatious, appropriate for receiving a caller, but not trying too hard to impress. She wore her dark hair in a simple style, pulled back to reveal her face without excessive decoration. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw what she always saw: a woman who didn't quite fit the mold society had created for her. Too tall, too angular, with features more striking than pretty. Eyes that looked at the world with too much intelligence, too much question. But today, for the first time in years, she felt something that might have been anticipation. Not hope. She was too practical for hope, but curiosity. A sense that something significant was about to happen, even if she couldn't predict what shape it would take. At precisely 2 o'clock, the butler appeared in the drawing room doorway. "Your Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft," he announced in tones of profound disapproval. And then the Duke walked into her drawing room, bringing with him an energy that seemed to change the very air in the space. He wore a dark coat and impeccably tailored trousers, his cravat tied with perfect precision. But it wasn't his clothes that commanded attention. It was the way he carried himself, with the kind of confidence that came from generations of power and privilege. He bowed correctly to Elara, but his eyes held that same intense focus she remembered from the opera house. "Miss Whitcombe, thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace." Elara gestured to one of the chairs near the fireplace. "Please sit. May I offer you tea?" "Thank you, no." He sat, but his posture remained alert, engaged. "I prefer not to waste time on formalities when there are more interesting conversations to be had." "Straight to business, then," Elara said, sitting across from him. "How refreshingly direct." "You strike me as a woman who would appreciate directness over pretense." "You're correct." Elara folded her hands in her lap, meeting his gaze without wavering. "So let me be direct as well, Your Grace. Why are you here? What do you want from me?" For the first time, something like surprise crossed his features. Most women would dance around such a question for hours. "I'm not most women." "No," he said quietly. "You're not, which is precisely why I'm here." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his attention focused entirely on her. "I'll be blunt, Miss Whitcombe. I need a wife. Not for love. I don't believe in that particular fairy tale, but for practical reasons. I need an heir to secure my estate. I need someone to manage my household. And I need someone intelligent enough to understand that marriage can be a partnership of mutual benefit rather than a romantic fantasy." Elara felt as though someone had dumped ice water over her head. "You're proposing marriage? To me? A woman you met for 5 minutes at the opera?" "I'm proposing the possibility of marriage," he corrected, "after appropriate courtship and consideration. But yes, that is my intention." "And what," Elara said slowly, "makes you think I would consider such an arrangement?" "Because you're 26 and unmarried by choice, not by accident. Because you've rejected 7 previous proposals from men who wanted to own you rather than partner with you. Because you're intelligent, educated, and trapped in a society that has no idea what to do with women like you." He paused. "And because I can offer you something none of those other men could. Genuine freedom within the structure of marriage." "Freedom," Elara repeated, "from a man whose wife died under mysterious circumstances. Forgive me if I find that claim somewhat ironic." There. She'd said it. Thrown the accusation directly into the space between them. The Duke's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger. "You want to know about Catherine?" "I want to know the truth about Catherine." He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "My marriage to Catherine was arranged by our families when she was 17 and I was 27. I barely knew her. She barely knew me. We were strangers forced into legal union for the sake of family alliances and dynastic expectations." He turned to face Elara. "I tried to be kind. I gave her every material comfort. I didn't force myself on her more than necessary to fulfill the marital contract. But I couldn't give her what she needed most, which was love, attention, emotional connection. Things I didn't know how to provide." "So she was lonely," Elara said quietly. "She was desperately lonely, isolated at the Yorkshire estate, surrounded by servants but with no real companions, no friends, no purpose. She became fragile, anxious. She saw shadows where there were none, heard whispers that didn't exist. And the pregnancy? Was a miracle, honestly. We'd been married 5 years with no children. I had largely stopped visiting her chambers, but one night, he stopped, a muscle working in his jaw. One night I tried, one last attempt to fulfill the obligation, and she conceived. And then she died. And then she died, he repeated, during a terrible storm. She was found at the bottom of the main staircase with a broken neck. The local magistrate ruled it an accident, but the servants whispered, London society whispered, and the whispers became accusations. Did you push her? Elara asked bluntly. He met her eyes without flinching. No, I did not push her, Miss Whitcombe, but I'm responsible for her death nonetheless. How? Because I trapped her in a marriage that slowly destroyed her, because I was too cold, too distant, too focused on duty to see her suffering until it was too late, because I failed her in every way that mattered. His voice was raw with something that sounded like genuine anguish. I didn't push her down those stairs, but I pushed her into the desperate state that made her careless, reckless, unaware of her own safety. Elara sat very still, processing his words. This was not the answer she'd expected. Most men would have denied everything, blamed others, protected their reputations at all costs. But this man, this dangerous, powerful duke, was taking responsibility for his failures with brutal honesty. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because if you're considering my proposal, you deserve to know exactly who I am, what I'm capable of, and what I'm not. He moved back to his chair and sat down, looking directly at her. I can't offer you love, Miss Whitcombe. I don't know how to love, but I can offer you respect, independence, and a partnership built on honesty rather than pretense. And an heir, Elara added. You want an heir? I do. The estate requires it, but I would never force that obligation on you. If you agreed to marry me, we would discuss terms openly, expectations, boundaries, everything that most couples hide behind romantic delusion. Elara leaned back in her chair, studying him. This is possibly the strangest marriage proposal I've ever received. Is it a proposal you'd consider? I don't know, she said honestly. You're asking me to bind myself legally to a man I don't know, who admits he can't love, whose first wife died in tragedy. That's not a small risk, Your Grace. No, he agreed. It's not. But consider what you'd gain. Title, wealth, freedom to pursue your interests without society's constant judgment, and a husband who would never try to control or diminish you. And what would you gain beyond an heir? He smiled slightly. A partner who challenges me, someone intelligent enough to engage with rather than simply manage. And perhaps, he paused, perhaps a chance to do better this time, to build something functional, even if not romantic. Elara stood and walked to the fireplace, her mind racing. Every rational instinct told her to refuse, to send him away, to protect herself from this dangerous gamble. But another part of her, the part that had always chafed against society's restrictions, whispered that this might be her only chance at something different. I need time, she said finally. Time to think, to consider. Of course. He rose as well. May I call on you again? In 3 days, perhaps? 3 days, Elara agreed. But I make no promises, Your Grace. I wouldn't expect promises yet, Miss Whitcombe, only honest consideration. He bowed and turned to leave, but at the doorway he paused and looked back at her. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I've never met anyone quite like you, and I find that refreshing. Then he was gone, leaving Elara alone with the fire and her chaotic thoughts. She sank into her chair and stared at the flames, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The Duke of Ravenscroft had essentially proposed marriage, a strategic, practical marriage with no illusions of love, and she hadn't immediately refused. More troubling, part of her was actually considering it. The door opened and Margaret rushed in, her face flushed with concern. Well, what happened? Are you all right? Elara laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. He proposed. Or rather, he proposed the possibility of proposing. A marriage of practical partnership with full honesty about expectations and limitations. Margaret sat down heavily. That's actually rather extraordinary. It's insane, Elara countered. He's a man accused of murdering his wife, and I'm sitting here considering binding myself to him legally. But you are considering it. I don't know what I'm doing, Elara admitted. Margaret, he told me everything. About Catherine, about his failures, about his inability to love. He laid it all out like a business contract. And somehow that honesty is more compelling than any romantic declaration I've ever received. Because you've always valued truth over pretty lies. Yes, but truth can be dangerous too. Elara looked at her cousin. What would you do? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, I would ask myself, am I more afraid of taking this risk or of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try? And there it was, the question Elara had been avoiding. She had 3 days to decide whether she was brave enough to step into the unknown with a man who promised nothing but honesty and respect in a world that offered women precious little of either. 3 days to choose between safety and risk. 3 days to determine the entire course of her life. The fire crackled in the hearth. Rain beat against the windows. And Elara Whitcombe sat in her drawing room, facing the most important decision she would ever make. The 3 days passed like torture. Elara found herself unable to focus on anything. Her books sat unread, her correspondence piled up unanswered, and even her beloved anatomy texts failed to hold her attention. Instead, she spent hours staring out windows, pacing her bedroom, and replaying every word the Duke had spoken in that drawing room. You're wearing a hole in the carpet, Margaret observed on the second day, watching Elara make another circuit around the morning room. I'm thinking, how you're spiraling. Margaret set down her embroidery, something she did only when genuinely concerned. Elara, you don't have to decide anything. You can simply tell him no when he returns. Can I? Elara stopped pacing and faced her cousin. Margaret, I'm 26 years old. In 10 years, I'll be considered a hopeless spinster. In 20, I'll be the eccentric old maid who frightens children and scandalizes dinner parties. Is that really preferable to taking a calculated risk? It's preferable to marrying a potential murderer. He's not a murderer, Elara said, though she wasn't entirely sure why she felt compelled to defend him. He's a man who made mistakes, who failed someone he should have protected. That's not the same as deliberate violence. You're defending him now, Margaret said quietly. That's how it starts, you know. First you rationalize, then you justify, then you're trapped. Or, Elara countered, first you think critically, then you evaluate evidence, then you make an informed decision rather than cowering behind fear and gossip. Margaret sighed. I can't protect you from this. You know that, don't you? Once you step into his world, I won't be able to reach you. I've never needed protecting before. Why start now? But that night, alone in her bedroom, Elara pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and wondered if Margaret was right. Was she rationalizing danger because she was desperate for escape? Was she so tired of her constrained life that she'd convinced herself a cage with slightly wider bars was actually freedom? The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold. Elara dressed with unusual care, choosing a gown of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. If she was going to make a life-altering decision, she might as well look formidable while doing it. The Duke arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, just as he had before. Punctual. Controlled. Everything about him spoke of discipline and order. He stood in her drawing room doorway, still wearing that same expression of focused intensity. Miss Whitcombe, Your Grace, she gestured to the chairs. Please. They sat across from each other, the fireplace crackling between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with expectation. Finally, the Duke said, Have you made a decision? Elara met his dark eyes steadily. I have questions first. Ask them. If I agreed to this arrangement, and I'm not saying I will, what exactly would our lives look like? Where would we live? How would we spend our time? What would you expect of me beyond producing an heir? He leaned back slightly, clearly having anticipated these questions. We would divide our time between my London townhouse and the Yorkshire estate. I spend winters in London for Parliament, summers in Yorkshire managing the lands. You would have complete freedom to pursue your interests, reading, studying, whatever intellectual pursuits engage you. I would expect you to manage the household staff and represent the family at necessary social functions, but beyond that, your time would be your own. And the matter of marital obligations? A faint color touched his cheekbones, the first sign of discomfort she'd seen from him. I would never force myself on you. We would need to come together, enough times to ensure conception. But it would be discussed beforehand, agreed upon mutually, not an assault in the dark. The frankness of it was almost shocking. Most men would have danced around the subject with euphemisms and awkward coughing. He simply stated facts. What about children? Elara pressed. If we had a son, an heir, would you expect more? A spare and then another. How many times would I be expected to risk my life in childbirth? His expression darkened. Once, maybe twice if you were willing, but I saw what pregnancy did to Catherine, the fear, the physical toll. I would never demand you endure that repeatedly just to fill a nursery. And if I couldn't conceive at all, or could only produce daughters, then we would adapt. He met her gaze without wavering. I'm not some medieval lord obsessed with male heirs. I need a child to inherit the estate. Male or female, I don't particularly care. If you couldn't conceive, we would explore other options. Adoption. Naming a distant cousin. I'm practical, Miss Whitcombe, not fanatical. Elara stood and walked to the window, her mind racing through calculations and possibilities. Behind her, she heard the Duke rise as well, his footsteps crossing the carpet to stand a respectful distance away. You're afraid, he said quietly. That's wise. You should be afraid. This is a considerable risk. I'm not afraid of you, Elara replied, turning to face him. I'm afraid of making a decision that looks like freedom, but is actually just a different kind of prison. Then let me make you a promise. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. If you agree to marry me, and if at any point you feel trapped or controlled or diminished, you tell me, directly, and we negotiate new terms. This isn't a dictatorship, Miss Whitcombe. It's a partnership. That means both parties have power to shape it. Legally, wives have no power. Everything I own would become yours. I would have no recourse if you decided to lock me away in Yorkshire and never let me leave. Legally, yes, but we can create private agreements, documents that ensure you retain control of certain assets, certain freedoms. My solicitors can draft something that protects you even within the constraints of marriage law. Elara stared at him. You do that? Put it in writing that I retain autonomy? I would, because I don't want a prisoner, Miss Whitcombe. I want a partner, and partners need equal footing, or the entire structure collapses. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't manipulation or empty promises. This was a man genuinely trying to offer something different from the traditional power dynamic of Victorian marriage. Elara took a deep breath. If I agree to this, and I'm still not certain I will, I want to see the Yorkshire estate first, the place where Catherine died. I want to walk those halls, see those rooms, understand what happened there. Something flickered across his face, pain perhaps, or reluctance. That's a difficult request. I know, but I can't commit to spending half my life in a place that might be haunted by tragedy without understanding what I'm walking into. He was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with something internal. Then finally, he nodded. Very well, we leave tomorrow. I'll arrange the train tickets. Tomorrow? Elara felt her heart jump. That's rather sudden. You wanted to see it. I'm showing it to you. His dark eyes held hers. Unless you're having second thoughts. It was a challenge, a test, and Elara had never been able to resist a challenge. Tomorrow, she agreed, but I'm bringing Margaret. I won't travel alone with you unchaperoned. Of course. I'll arrange for proper accommodations. He moved toward the door, then paused. Miss Whitcombe, thank you for considering this seriously rather than simply dismissing it out of fear. After he left, Elara stood in the drawing room for several minutes, trying to process what she'd just agreed to. She was going to Yorkshire, to the Duke's remote estate, to the place where his wife had died. Margaret was going to lose her mind. She was right. Absolutely not! Margaret's voice rose to near hysteria when Elara told her the plan that evening. Elara, this is madness. You cannot travel to his isolated estate to investigate a death. That's how people disappear. Which is why you're coming with me, Elara said calmly, though her own nerves were far from calm. You'll be there as witness to everything. If anything inappropriate happens, you can report it. Report it to whom? After you've already been compromised, or worse? Margaret paced the room frantically. Why would you agree to this? Because I need to know the truth. Not the gossip, not the speculation, the actual truth about what happened to Catherine Ravenscroft. Elara caught Margaret's hand, stilling her pacing. I can't make an informed decision based on rumors and fear. I need facts. And if the facts confirm he's dangerous, then I refuse his proposal and we return to London with our answer. Elara squeezed Margaret's hands. Please, I need you with me. I can't do this alone. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then sighed in defeat. You're the most stubborn, foolish, brilliant woman I've ever known. And I'm coming with you because someone needs to keep you alive long enough to regret these decisions. They departed the next morning on the early train to Yorkshire, the Duke having arranged a private compartment for propriety's sake. The journey took most of the day, the landscape gradually shifting from London's urban sprawl to rolling countryside, and eventually to the wild, windswept moors of the north. The Duke sat across from them, occasionally pointing out landmarks or estate boundaries, but mostly maintaining a thoughtful silence. He seemed different outside of London, less controlled perhaps, or simply more at ease in less constrained spaces. As twilight approached, the carriage from the train station wound its way up a long drive flanked by ancient oak trees. And then rising from the moors like something out of a Gothic novel, Ravenscroft Hall appeared. It was enormous, a sprawling stone manor house with multiple wings, tall windows that reflected the dying light, and a brooding presence that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Not ugly exactly, but severe, imposing, the kind of house that demanded respect rather than affection. It's very large, Margaret said weakly. It houses 43 rooms, not including servants' quarters, the Duke replied. Built in 1612, expanded several times over the centuries. My family has held these lands for nearly 300 years. The weight of that history pressed down on Elara as they entered through the massive front doors. Inside, the entrance hall was all dark wood paneling and ancestral portraits staring down with disapproving eyes. Servants lined up to greet their master, their expressions carefully neutral as they took in the two women accompanying him. Mrs. Whitmore, the Duke addressed the stern-looking housekeeper. Please show Miss Margaret to the blue guest room. Miss Elara will take the rose suite in the east wing. The east wing, Your Grace. Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. Are you certain? Quite certain. Something unspoken passed between them, some significance Elara couldn't quite grasp, but she filed it away for later consideration. After a brief supper served in an echoing dining room that could have seated 30, Margaret was escorted to her room, clearly exhausted from travel. The Duke turned to Elara. Would you like to see the house now? Or would you prefer to rest? Now, Elara said immediately. I want to see it while my mind is clear. He nodded, something like approval in his eyes. This way. He led her through a maze of corridors, each one lined with more portraits, more dark wood, more evidence of wealth and power accumulated over centuries. They passed drawing rooms and libraries, a music room with a dust-covered pianoforte, a portrait gallery where generations of Ravenscrofts gazed down with varying degrees of aristocratic disdain. Finally, they reached the grand staircase. It was wide and sweeping, with an ornate balustrade carved from dark wood. Tall windows lined the wall, and Elara could imagine how the wind would howl through any gaps during a storm. At the bottom, the marble floor gleamed coldly. This is where she was found, the Duke said quietly, his voice carefully devoid of emotion. At the bottom of these stairs. Her neck was broken. Death would have been instantaneous. Elara looked up the staircase, trying to imagine what had happened. A woman, 5 months pregnant, descending these stairs during a storm. Had she been frightened, distracted, or had she made a choice in that moment, a desperate choice to end unbearable suffering? Where was she going? Elara asked. In the middle of a storm, where would she have been headed? The Duke's jaw tightened. I don't know. The servant said she'd been in her rooms all day. I was in London on business. When the storm hit that evening, she apparently emerged and began wandering the halls. One of the maids saw her on the upper landing, looking distressed. And then she fell. Yes. Elara walked slowly up the stairs, her hand trailing along the balustrade. At the top, she turned and looked down. It was a long way to fall. Fatal, certainly, even without the pregnancy. "Show me her rooms," she said. The Duke led her down another corridor to a set of double doors. He opened them to reveal a suite of rooms decorated in pale blues and creams, pretty, feminine, but somehow lifeless, like a stage set rather than a home. Elara walked through the sitting room, the bedroom, touching surfaces that felt cold despite the fire burning in the grate. There were no personal items, no books, no evidence that anyone had actually lived here. "You removed everything," she observed. "After she died, yes. I couldn't bear to see her things. They reminded me of my failures." Elara turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes betraying something deeper. Grief, perhaps? Or guilt? "Tell me what really happened," she said. "Not the official story. The truth." He was silent for so long she thought he might refuse. Then finally he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Improper, certainly, but necessary for what he was about to say. "Catherine was never meant to be a duchess," he began, his voice low. "She was the daughter of a minor baron, educated enough to be acceptable, but not prepared for the isolation of life here. Our families arranged the marriage for financial reasons. Her father owed mine money, and the debt could be forgiven if she married me." He moved to the window, staring out at the darkening moors. "She was 17. I was 27. She was terrified of me from the beginning. I could see it in her eyes every time I entered a room. But I didn't know how to comfort her. I'd been raised to control emotion, not express it, so I gave her space, distance. I thought I was being kind." "You were being absent," Elara said quietly. "Yes." He didn't defend himself. "I was absent, and that absence allowed her fear to grow into something worse. She began seeing things that weren't there, shadows in corners, whispers in empty rooms. The servants reported that she talked to herself, claimed people were watching her. I brought in doctors, but they couldn't find anything physically wrong. She was having a mental collapse." "Yes, and I didn't know how to stop it. I tried talking to her, tried bringing her to London for society and distraction, but nothing helped. She retreated further into herself." His hands clenched behind his back. "When she became pregnant, I hoped it might give her purpose. Something to focus on beyond her fears. But it only made things worse. She became convinced the child wasn't safe, that something would harm it. She barely slept, barely ate. And the night she died? I was in London, meeting with solicitors about estate business. A storm rolled in, one of those violent Yorkshire storms that shakes the very foundations. The servant said she emerged from her rooms in her nightdress, completely agitated. She was shouting about needing to leave, needing to get away. One of the maids tried to calm her, but Catherine pushed past her and ran toward the stairs. His voice broke slightly. The maid saw her reach the top landing, saw her pause, looking down. And then, she doesn't know if Catherine slipped or jumped or simply lost her footing, but she fell. All the way down. And by the time the maid reached her, she was already gone. Elara felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, but profound sadness. For the young woman who'd been so desperately unhappy. For the man who'd failed to see her suffering until too late. For the unborn child who'd never had a chance. "You blame yourself," she said. "I am to blame," he replied. "I saw the signs and did nothing effective to help. I let her deteriorate rather than face the uncomfortable truth that my marriage was destroying someone." "But you didn't push her." He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw raw honesty. "No, Miss Whitcombe, I did not push her. But I pushed her to that moment through years of neglect and emotional abandonment. The fact that I wasn't physically present when she fell doesn't absolve me of responsibility." Elara walked to where he stood and looked up at his face, at the lines of grief and guilt etched there. Most men would never admit such culpability. They'd blame the woman, or fate, or anything but themselves. Most men are cowards who can't face their own failures. And you? I'm trying not to be. He held her gaze. "Which is why I'm telling you all of this before you make any decision. You deserve to know exactly what kind of man you'd be binding yourself to, one who has already failed catastrophically at marriage once." The room felt suddenly very small, very intimate. They stood close enough that Elara could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. "I appreciate your honesty," she said quietly. "More than you know." "Does it change your decision?" Elara considered carefully. It doesn't make me trust you less. If anything, it makes me trust you more. A man who can face his failures with such brutal honesty is less likely to repeat them than one who denies they exist. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or relief. You're extraordinary, do you know that? I'm practical, she corrected. There's a difference. A knock at the door broke the moment. Mrs. Whitmore's voice came through, carefully neutral. Your Grace, Miss Margaret is asking after Miss Elara. The Duke stepped back, restoring proper distance. Of course. Miss Elara, shall I escort you to your cousin? They walked through the darkened corridors in silence, but Elara's mind was racing. She'd come here looking for evidence of danger, of violence, of something that would justify her fears. Instead, she'd found a man carrying crushing guilt for failures he couldn't undo, trying desperately not to repeat past mistakes. That didn't make him safe, but it made him honest. And in Elara's experience, honesty was rarer and more valuable than safety. Margaret was waiting in the blue guest room, wrapped in a shawl and looking anxious. Are you all right? You were gone so long. I'm fine. Elara sat on the edge of the bed. He showed me where Catherine died, told me what happened. And I believe him. Margaret's eyes widened. Elara, I know what it sounds like, but Margaret, you didn't see his face. You didn't hear the way he took responsibility for failures most men would never even acknowledge. Elara gripped her cousin's hands. He's not a murderer. He's a man who made terrible mistakes and is trying not to repeat them. That doesn't mean you should marry him. No, Elara agreed. But it means I'm not running away out of fear. If I marry him, it will be a calculated choice. If I don't, it will be for rational reasons, not panic. Margaret searched her face. You've already decided, haven't you? You're going to accept him. Elara opened her mouth to deny it, then stopped. Because Margaret was right. Somewhere between the grand staircase and Catherine's empty rooms, between the Duke's raw confession and his refusal to make excuses, Elara had made her choice. Yes, she said simply. I'm going to accept him. You're insane. Probably, Elara smiled slightly. But I'd rather be insane and free than sane and trapped in London society for the rest of my life. That night, Elara lay in the Rose Suite, which she now understood had been Catherine's rooms, redecorated and cleared of memory, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, wind howled across the moors, rattling windows and moaning through gaps in the ancient stonework. She thought about the young woman who died here, about loneliness and fear and desperation, about the man who'd failed to save her but was willing to face that failure rather than hide from it. And she thought about her own choice, the decision to step into this Gothic manor, this complicated legacy, this partnership that promised honesty but guaranteed nothing. Tomorrow, she would tell the Duke her answer. Tomorrow, she would commit to a path that society would condemn and her family would mourn. But tonight, in these rooms where tragedy had unfolded, Elara felt something unexpected. Hope. Not hope for love, she was too practical for such romantic delusions. But hope that she might build something genuine with a man who valued truth over pretense, partnership over possession, honesty over comfort. The wind continued to howl, the old house creaked and settled, and Elara Whitcombe closed her eyes, ready to face whatever came next, because she'd made her choice, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited. Morning came with pale winter light filtering through the tall windows. Elara woke to find a maid stoking the fire. The young woman's movements quick and efficient, but her eyes watchful, assessing. The servants here were different from London staff, quieter, more guarded, as though they'd learned to keep their thoughts hidden behind professional masks. Good morning, miss, the maid said, bobbing a curtsy. His Grace requests your presence in the breakfast room at 9 o'clock, if it pleases you. It pleases me, Elara replied, sitting up. The rose-colored walls seemed less oppressive in daylight, though the room still carried an echo of the woman who'd once occupied it. What's your name? The maid looked surprised at being asked. Sarah, miss. How long have you worked here, Sarah? 5 years, miss. Sarah's hand stilled on the poker. Since I was 14. Then you were here when the Duchess died. Sarah's face shuddered immediately, all animation draining from her features. Yes, miss. I was here. Were you the maid who saw her fall? No, miss, that was Alice. She left service after it happened, went to live with her sister in Newcastle. Sarah stood abruptly. Will there be anything else, miss? The dismissal was clear. Whatever Sarah knew or thought about Catherine's death, she had no intention of sharing it with a stranger, particularly not one who might become the new Duchess. Elara dressed carefully in a day gown of deep green wool and went to find Margaret, who was already awake and pacing her room like a caged animal. I barely slept, Margaret said without preamble. This house makes sounds all night, creaking, settling like it's alive and breathing. It's 300 years old, Elara replied. Old houses make noise. Old houses where young women died mysteriously make very specific kinds of noise. Margaret grabbed Elara's arm. Please tell me you've reconsidered. Tell me we're leaving today. We're not leaving. I told you, I've made my decision. To marry a man you barely know in a house that might be cursed? There's no such thing as curses, Margaret. Only tragedy and the stories people tell about it. But even as she said it, Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Yorkshire cold. There was something about Ravenscroft Hall that felt wrong. Not evil exactly, but heavy. Weighted with grief and secrets that hadn't been properly laid to rest. The Duke was already in the breakfast room when they arrived, standing by the windows with a cup of coffee, looking out over the moors. He turned at their entrance, his expression carefully neutral. Miss Elara, Miss Margaret, I trust you slept well? As well as could be expected, Elara replied, accepting a plate from the sideboard. The spread was lavish, eggs, bacon, kippers, toast, preserves, but she found her appetite had fled. The house has quite a presence. A diplomatic way of saying it's gloomy and oppressive. He smiled faintly. I know what it is. I grew up here. Sometimes I think these walls absorbed centuries of Ravenscroft coldness, and now they radiate it back. Margaret cleared her throat pointedly. Your Grace, when do you intend to return to London? We should probably— Actually, Elara interrupted, setting down her fork with deliberate care. I'd like to stay another day or two. There are things I want to understand about this place before we leave. The Duke's gaze sharpened with interest. What things? The estate, the land, the people who work here. If I'm to be mistress of this house, she paused, letting the implication hang in the air, I should know what I'm agreeing to manage. Elara, Margaret said urgently, can we speak privately? Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of His Grace. Elara kept her eyes on the Duke. I'm done with secrets and careful diplomacy. If we're to have a partnership built on honesty, it starts now. The Duke set down his coffee cup slowly. You're accepting my proposal. I'm accepting the possibility of accepting your proposal, with conditions. Name them. I want to meet the staff properly. Hear their stories about this place, about Catherine, about what life here is actually like. I want to walk the grounds and see the estate operations. And I want access to Catherine's personal papers, her letters, her diary if she kept one, anything that might help me understand who she was and what happened to her. The Duke's jaw tightened. That's an unusual request. You promised honesty and partnership. This is what that looks like. Full transparency, even when it's uncomfortable. For a long moment, he studied her face. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. Very well. I'll have Mrs. Whitmore retrieve Catherine's papers from storage, and I'll arrange for you to tour the estate operations this afternoon. As for the staff, you may speak to whomever you wish. I won't interfere. Margaret made a small, distressed sound. This is madness. Complete madness. Perhaps, Elara agreed. But it's honest madness. That's an improvement over polite lies. After breakfast, the Duke departed for the estate office to manage business, leaving Elara and Margaret alone. Margaret immediately grabbed Elara's arm and pulled her into an empty drawing room. What are you doing? Margaret demanded. Demanding to read a dead woman's diary? Interrogating the staff? You're acting like you're investigating a crime. I am investigating, Elara replied calmly. Not a crime necessarily, but the truth. Margaret, I can't commit my entire life to a man and a place without understanding what I'm walking into. Would you prefer I go in blind? I'd prefer you not go in at all. That's not an option anymore. Elara walked to the window, looking out at the wild Yorkshire landscape. I've made my choice. Now I need to understand the full consequences of it. By mid-morning, Mrs. Whitmore appeared with a leather-bound trunk, her expression deeply disapproving. The late Duchess's personal effects as requested. His Grace has given permission for you to examine them. The trunk was carried to the library, a vast room lined with books from floor to ceiling, with leather chairs positioned near a massive fireplace. Elara dismissed the servants and opened the trunk with Margaret hovering anxiously nearby. Inside were the remnants of Catherine Ravenscroft's brief life, letters from her mother and sisters, a pressed flower collection, watercolor paintings of the moors, and several leather-bound journals filled with delicate handwriting. Elara picked up the most recent journal and opened to a random page. The date was 6 months before Catherine's death. "The shadows are worse today," Catherine had written in an increasingly erratic hand. "They watch me from the corners, waiting. I told Adrian, but he looked at me with such pity, such distance. He thinks I'm mad. Perhaps I am. Perhaps this house has driven me to it. The baby moves inside me and I fear for it. This place will poison it as it has poisoned me." Elara's throat tightened. She flipped to another entry, this one from just weeks before the fall. "I cannot sleep. The whispers grow louder each night. They tell me terrible things, that Adrian wishes me gone, that the child isn't his, that I should leave before something dreadful happens. But where would I go? I have no money of my own, no family who would take me back after I've failed so spectacularly at being a wife. I am trapped, a bird in a gilded cage beating my wings bloody against bars that will never open." "Oh, Catherine," Elara whispered. The tragedy of it was overwhelming, a young woman slowly fracturing under the weight of isolation and fear, her descent into mental instability documented in her own desperate handwriting. Margaret read over her shoulder. "This is heartbreaking. She was so young, so alone." Elara continued reading, searching for anything that might indicate violence or foul play. But all she found was escalating paranoia, desperate loneliness, and increasingly fragmented thoughts as Catherine's mental state deteriorated. The final entry was dated the day before her death. "The storm is coming. I can feel it in my bones. Everything will change when the storm arrives. Perhaps it will wash away the shadows. Perhaps it will wash me away instead. I think I would welcome either outcome. Anything is better than this endless gray existence where I am neither truly alive nor granted the mercy of death. If something happens to me, please know, it was never his fault. Adrian tried in his limited way, but some people cannot be saved, no matter how much others might wish to save them." Elara closed the journal carefully, her hands trembling. She knew. On some level, she knew what was going to happen. "You think she jumped?" Margaret asked quietly. "I think she was in so much pain that the distinction between falling and jumping stopped mattering." Elara pressed her fingers to her eyes, fighting unexpected tears. "And I think she was desperately trying to absolve the Duke of blame, even as she fell apart." A sound at the door made them both turn. The Duke stood in the doorway, his face carefully blank, but his eyes shadowed with pain. "How long have you been there?" Elara asked. "Long enough to hear you reading." He stepped into the room. "I've never read those journals. I couldn't bear to. Are they as terrible as I imagined?" "They're the writings of a woman drowning," Elara said gently, reaching for anything to keep her head above water and finding nothing solid to grasp. He crossed to the fireplace and braced his hands against the mantel, his shoulders tight with tension. "I should have done more. Brought in better doctors. Taken her away from this house. Something. Anything." "She absolves you in the final entry," Elara said. "She wrote that it was never your fault. That doesn't make it true." His voice was rough. "Her forgiveness doesn't change my failure." Margaret had gone very still, watching this exchange with wide eyes. Elara set the journal down and approached the Duke carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal. "What would you have done differently?" she asked. "If you could go back, what would you change?" He turned to face her, his expression raw. "Everything. I would have talked to her more, listened when she tried to tell me about the shadows and whispers instead of dismissing it as feminine hysteria. I would have taken her to London permanently, found her friends in society instead of isolating her here. I would have—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I would have tried to love her, even if I didn't know how. She deserved that attempt." "And now?" Elara pressed. "What do you promise to do differently with me?" The directness of the question seemed to steady him. He straightened, meeting her gaze squarely. I promise to listen when you tell me something is wrong, to take your concerns seriously, not dismiss them, to be present instead of absent. And if you start to suffer the way Catherine did, I promise to act, to get you help, to change our circumstances, to do whatever is necessary to prevent another tragedy. Even if it means acknowledging failure again. Even then, Elara made her decision in that moment, not based on romantic feeling or even entirely rational calculation, but on something deeper. This man was broken in some fundamental way, still carrying wounds from his catastrophic first marriage. But he was also honest enough to face his failures and determined enough to prevent their repetition. That was worth the risk. I'll marry you, she said quietly. The Duke froze. What? I'll marry you on the terms we discussed: partnership, honesty, mutual respect. I'll be your wife and give you the heir you need. But I want the legal documents you mentioned, protecting my autonomy. And I want your word that you'll keep the promises you just made. You have it. His voice was hoarse. All of it. Whatever you need. Margaret made a sound of protest, but Elara raised a hand to silence her. I know what I'm doing, Margaret. I know the risks. But I'm choosing this anyway. When? The Duke asked. When will you marry me? 2 months. That gives us time to arrange the legal documents, plan a small ceremony, and prepare. And it gives me time to ensure this is truly what I want. And if you change your mind in those 2 months, then I'll tell you, and we'll end the engagement. No recriminations, no scandal beyond what already exists. Elara held out her hand. Do we have an agreement, Your Grace? He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. We have an agreement, Miss Whitcombe. They shook on it like business partners negotiating a contract, which, in essence, they were. This wasn't romance. It wasn't love. But it was honest, and in Elara's experience, honesty was worth more than pretty lies. Margaret looked between them with an expression of profound concern. You're both insane. Probably, Elara agreed, but we're honestly insane. That's progress. That afternoon, the Duke gave Elara a tour of the estate operations as promised. The farms, the tenant cottages, the mill, the vast acreage that generated the family wealth. She met shepherds and farmers, millers and craftsmen, all of whom regarded her with cautious curiosity. And everywhere she went, she heard whispers. Not the supernatural kind that had plagued Catherine, but the human kind: gossip, speculation, concern. Another wife for the Duke, one farmer muttered to another, not realizing Elara could hear. Poor lass doesn't know what she's walking into. This one looks harder than the last, his companion replied. Maybe she'll survive what the other couldn't. Elara pretended not to hear, but the words settled in her stomach like stones. These people expected her to fail, expected her to crack under the pressure of being the Duchess of Ravenscroft. She'd proved them wrong. They returned to London 3 days later, and the news of their engagement spread through society like plague. The reactions ranged from scandalized horror to morbid fascination to outright condemnation. Lady Thornbury cut Elara directly at the opera, turning her back with deliberate cruelty. Lord Pembroke made a tasteless joke at his club about the Duke's tendency to lose wives. The gossip rags published speculation about how long Elara would last before meeting a similar fate to Catherine. Elara's mother took to her bed again, this time with palpitations. Her father retreated to his club and refused to discuss the matter. Even Margaret, despite her loyalty, couldn't hide her deep misgivings. Society has turned against you completely, Margaret said one evening as they sat in Elara's drawing room, reading the latest poisonous column in the society pages. They're calling you reckless, desperate, a fool, who's signing her own death warrant. Let them call me whatever they like, Elara replied, though the words stung more than she wanted to admit. Their opinions don't change my decision, but they'll make your life miserable. You'll be ostracized, gossiped about, treated like a pariah. I've been treated as an oddity my entire life for refusing to conform. This is simply a different flavor of the same rejection. But 3 weeks before the wedding, something happened that changed everything. Elara was in the Duke's London townhouse, reviewing the legal documents his solicitors had prepared, when Mrs. Whitmore arrived unexpectedly from Yorkshire. The housekeeper's face was grim, her manner agitated. Your Grace, she said, addressing the Duke, I need to speak with you privately. It's urgent. Anything you need to say can be said in front of Miss Elara, the Duke replied. We agreed to transparency. Mrs. Whitmore's lips thinned with disapproval. Very well, we've had a visitor at Ravenscroft Hall, a woman claiming to have information about the late Duchess's death. She says she was Catherine's lady's maid, dismissed shortly before the tragedy. And she has letters, Your Grace. Letters that tell a very different story than the official account. The Duke went very still. What kind of letters? Letters from the late Duchess to her sister, describing disturbing things. Threats. Violence. Fear for her life. Mrs. Whitmore pulled a packet of folded papers from her bag. This woman, she calls herself Miss Hartley, says Catherine was planning to leave you, that she feared for her safety and the safety of her unborn child. Elara felt the room tilt. That's impossible. I read Catherine's journals. She absolved the Duke of blame. Perhaps the journals were incomplete, Mrs. Whitmore said coldly. Or perhaps the Duchess wrote different truths to different audiences. The Duke took the letters with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. He read the first one, his face draining of color, then the second. By the third, he looked as though he might be sick. What do they say? Elara demanded. He handed them to her without speaking. The letters were devastating. In them, Catherine described the Duke as cold, controlling, occasionally violent when displeased. She claimed he'd threatened her when she spoke of leaving, told her she'd never see her family again if she tried to escape the marriage. She wrote of bruises hidden under long sleeves, of shouting matches behind closed doors, of growing terror as her pregnancy advanced. He said he would rather see me dead than divorced, one letter read. He said the scandal of a failed marriage would destroy the Ravenscroft name, and he would never permit it. I am trapped, dearest sister, truly trapped. I fear what will happen when the child is born. I fear I may not survive it. The final letter was dated 2 days before Catherine's death. I have made arrangements to leave, she wrote. A friend has offered me sanctuary in Scotland until the child is born. I will go tomorrow night, during the storm when the household is distracted. If you receive this letter and I have not arrived safely within a week, please know that something terrible has happened. Please do not let them say it was an accident. Please fight for the truth. Elara's hands shook as she set the letters down. She looked at the Duke, whose face had gone absolutely blank. The expression of a man in complete shock. Are these real? She asked. Did you write these letters? I don't know. His voice was hollow. I mean, I don't know if Catherine wrote them. The handwriting looks similar, but I can't be certain. And the things they describe, I never threatened her. I never laid a hand on her in violence. This is madness. Or it's the truth you've been hiding, Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. Your Grace, I've served this family for 30 years. I loved your father, but I cannot in good conscience allow another young woman to walk into danger without warning. The Duke's head snapped up, fury finally breaking through the shock. You believe this? You think I murdered my wife? I think these letters exist. I think Catherine was planning to flee. And I think she died very conveniently before she could escape. Mrs. Whitmore's voice was steel. What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that Miss Elara knows the full truth before she binds herself to you. Elara felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew, everything she'd believed about the Duke's honesty and Catherine's tragedy, was suddenly in question. I need to speak with this Miss Hartley, she said. Where is she? She's waiting at an inn in Yorkshire, Mrs. Whitmore replied. She refused to come to London, fearing the Duke's influence here. She'll only speak to you directly, Miss Elara. Then I'll go to Yorkshire, tonight. Elara, no, the Duke said urgently. This could be a trap, someone trying to extort money or cause scandal. You can't trust— I can't trust anything right now, Elara interrupted, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Including you. These letters describe a completely different man than the one I thought I knew. Either they're forgeries designed to destroy you, or you've been lying to me from the beginning. Either way, I need the truth. Then I'm coming with you. No. Elara stood, gathering the letters. If this woman is frightened of you, your presence will prevent her from speaking freely. I'll go with Mrs. Whitmore and Margaret. You'll stay here. I won't allow— You don't get to allow or forbid anything, Elara cut him off sharply. We're not married yet. You have no authority over me. And if these letters are real, you never will be. She swept out of the room before he could respond, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Behind her, she heard the Duke call her name, but she didn't turn back. In the hallway, Margaret was waiting, having heard everything through the door. "We're going to Yorkshire." "We're going to Yorkshire," Elara confirmed grimly. "And we're going to find out if I've been courted by an honest man haunted by tragedy, or a murderer clever enough to make me believe his lies." They departed within the hour, racing north on the late train. Elara sat in the private compartment clutching the letters, reading them over and over, trying to reconcile the terrified woman who'd written them with the melancholic, lonely Catherine she'd encountered in the journals. Could both versions be true? Could Catherine have written honestly to her sister about violence and threats while also absolving the Duke in her private diary? Or had one set of documents been forged? And if so, which ones? The train rattled through the darkness, carrying Elara toward answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Because if the letters were real, everything she thought she knew was a lie. And if they were false, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to destroy the Duke's reputation and her engagement. Either way, the truth would change everything. The inn where Miss Hartley waited was a small, shabby establishment in a village 5 miles from Ravenscroft Hall. They arrived near midnight, exhausted and tense. The innkeeper directed them to a room on the second floor where a woman in her 30s sat waiting, her face drawn with anxiety. "Miss Elara Whitcombe?" the woman asked as they entered. "I am. You're Miss Hartley." "I am. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Miss Hartley gestured to the chairs. "Please sit. I know this is difficult, but there are things you need to know before you marry that man." Elara sat, her spine rigid with tension. "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out." Miss Hartley took a deep breath and began to speak. And with every word, the careful structure Elara had built around her engagement began to crumble, revealing something far darker underneath Miss Hartley's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes darting between Elara, Margaret, and Mrs. Whitmore, as though assessing whether she could trust them. The shabby inn room felt suffocating, the single candle on the table casting shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. "I served as Catherine's lady's maid for 2 years before her death," Miss Hartley began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was there through her entire pregnancy. I saw things, heard things, things that terrified me." "What things?" Elara demanded, her patience worn thin by the journey and the weight of those damning letters. "The Duke's rages," Miss Hartley said. "He would shout at her behind closed doors. I heard furniture overturning, glass breaking. Once I saw her with a bruise on her wrist. She said she'd bumped into a door, but I knew better, and as her pregnancy progressed, his anger grew worse." "That contradicts everything he told me," Elara said slowly. "He claimed he was distant, absent, but never violent." "Of course that's what he'd claim." Miss Hartley leaned forward urgently. "Miss Whitcombe, powerful men lie. They lie so convincingly that even they start to believe their own stories. The Duke wanted to be rid of Catherine. She was unstable, embarrassing, a liability to his reputation. When she threatened to leave, to create a scandal by fleeing while pregnant with his heir, she stopped, her voice breaking. He couldn't allow that, so he ensured she never got the chance." Margaret gasped. "You're saying he pushed her?" "I'm saying she died very conveniently on the exact night she planned to escape." Miss Hartley pulled out another letter, this one addressed to her directly. "Catherine sent this to my sister's address 3 days before her death, asking me to help her flee. But I was dismissed that same afternoon. The Duke claimed I'd been stealing, which was a lie. He sent me away with no references, ensuring I couldn't work as a lady's maid again. By the time I learned what had happened to Catherine, it was too late." Elara took the letter with trembling hands. Catherine's handwriting covered the page in increasingly frantic script. "Dearest Anna, I must leave this place or I will not survive. The Duke has made it clear that divorce is impossible, that scandal would destroy him, and that he would rather I be dead than humiliated. I fear for my life and for my child's. Please help me. I trust no one else. If you receive this and I have not contacted you within the week, please know that something terrible has happened. Tell my story. Do not let him bury the truth as he has buried me." The words made Elara's blood run cold. This was not the voice of a woman suffering delusions. This was terror, clear-eyed and desperate. Why are you coming forward now? Mrs. Whitmore asked sharply. Why wait 3 years if you believe the Duke murdered his wife? Miss Hartley's face flushed with shame. Because I was afraid. The Duke has power, connections, wealth. Who would believe a dismissed lady's maid with no references over a Duke? I would have been called a liar, possibly arrested for slander. But when I heard he was engaged again, she looked directly at Elara. I couldn't let another woman walk into that house without knowing the truth. I couldn't carry another death on my conscience. Elara stood abruptly and walked to the small window, staring out at the dark Yorkshire night. Her mind raced through everything she knew, everything she'd seen, everything the Duke had told her, the raw honesty in his voice when he'd described his failures, the pain in his eyes when he'd read Catherine's journals, the careful way he'd promised to do better, be better. Had all of it been performance? Manipulation designed to make her trust him? Or was this woman lying? I need to see where Catherine was planning to go, Elara said suddenly. This friend in Scotland who offered sanctuary, who was it? Do you have a name, an address? Miss Hartley hesitated. Lady Pemberton. She was Catherine's closest friend from school, but she died last year, influenza. There's no way to verify the arrangement now. How convenient, Elara said coldly. No witnesses, no evidence beyond these letters. The letters are evidence, Miss Hartley protested. Letters can be forged. Elara turned to face her. You claim the Duke is a liar who manipulates truth to serve his purposes. But you could be doing exactly the same thing. You were dismissed without references. That's motive for revenge. These letters could be your fabrication, designed to destroy him. Miss Hartley's face went white. I would never. Prove it, Elara interrupted. Show me something that can be verified independently. A witness who saw the Duke's violence. A doctor who treated Catherine's injuries. Something beyond your word and letters that may or may not be authentic. The room fell silent. Miss Hartley's mouth worked, but no sound came out. Finally, she whispered, There's Sarah, the housemaid at Ravenscroft Hall. She saw things too. She can verify what I'm telling you. Sarah already told me she wasn't the maid who saw Catherine fall, Elara said. And when I asked about the Duchess's death, she refused to discuss it. Because she's terrified of the Duke. Miss Hartley's voice rose desperately. They all are. The entire household lives in fear of displeasing him. But if you can get her alone away from the hall, she might tell you the truth. Elara looked at Mrs. Whitmore. Is this true? Are the servants afraid of the Duke? Mrs. Whitmore's expression was complicated, loyalty warring with something else. His Grace can be exacting in his standards. He demands efficiency and discretion. Some might interpret that as intimidation. That's not an answer. No, Mrs. Whitmore admitted, it's not. But it's all I'm prepared to say while I'm still in his employ. The ambiguity of it frustrated Elara beyond measure. Everyone had their own version of truth, their own perspective shaped by fear or loyalty or self-interest. How was she supposed to navigate through all these competing narratives to find what was actually real? I'm going to Ravenscroft Hall, Elara announced. Tonight. I'm going to speak to Sarah myself and to any other servants who might have information. And then I'm going to confront the Duke directly with everything I've learned. That's dangerous, Margaret said urgently. Elara, if he truly is violent, then I need to know before I marry him. Elara's voice was steel. I won't run away based on accusations alone. But I won't ignore them either. I'm going to find the truth, whatever it costs. Miss Hartley stood as well. Please be careful, Miss Whitcombe. Catherine thought she could manage him too. Look where that led. The word sent a chill down Elara's spine, but she refused to show fear. She'd chosen this path, chosen to investigate, to question, to demand answers rather than accept comfortable lies. Now she had to see it through. They rode to Ravenscroft Hall in a hired carriage, arriving near 2 a.m. The house loomed against the night sky like a sleeping beast, only a few windows lit from within. Elara had the driver wait and approached the servants' entrance with Margaret and Mrs. Whitmore flanking her. The night porter answered their knock with bleary confusion. Miss Whitcombe, we weren't expecting— I need to speak with Sarah immediately, Elara said. Wake her and bring her to the kitchen. Tell her it's urgent and she's not in any trouble. The porter hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to obey this woman who wasn't yet mistress of the house. Mrs. Whitmore settled it with a sharp command. Do as Miss Elara says. Now." 10 minutes later, Sarah appeared in the kitchen, wrapped in a shawl over her nightdress, her young face tight with anxiety. "Miss, what's happened?" Elara gestured for her to sit at the large wooden table. "I need you to tell me the truth about the Duchess Catherine, everything you saw or heard, and I need you to know that whatever you say, I'll protect you from any consequences." Sarah's eyes widened with fear. "I can't, miss. I need this position. My family depends on my wages." "You'll have a position regardless," Elara promised. "If what you tell me results in your dismissal, I'll personally ensure you're employed elsewhere with full references. You have my word." Sarah looked at Mrs. Whitmore, who nodded confirmation. Then slowly, the young maid began to speak. "The Duchess was sad, miss. So terribly sad. She wandered the halls at night, talking to herself, sometimes crying. We all felt sorry for her, but we didn't know how to help. His Grace," she swallowed hard, "His Grace barely spoke to her. He'd come home from London and go straight to his study, sometimes not seeing her for days, even though they lived in the same house." "Did you ever see him hurt her?" Elara asked directly. Sarah shook her head vehemently. "No, miss, never. I never saw bruises or injuries, and I never heard shouting or violence, just silence. Terrible, cold silence." "What about the night she died?" Sarah's face went pale. "There was a storm, horrible wind and rain. The Duchess had been in her rooms all day, refusing meals. Then, around midnight, she came out. I was in the hallway because I'd heard strange sounds, branches hitting windows, I thought. But it was her. She was in her nightdress, barefoot, looking—" Sarah's voice broke. "Looking like she didn't quite see what was real anymore. Her eyes were wrong, miss. Like she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't." "What did she say?" "She said, 'I have to leave before the shadows take me.' She said the baby will be safe in Scotland, and then she ran toward the stairs." Tears streamed down Sarah's face now. "I called after her, tried to follow, but she was so fast. And then I heard the sound, this terrible, final sound. When I reached the landing and looked down—" She couldn't continue. Elara reached across the table and took the girl's hand. "You witnessed an accident, a tragedy, not a murder." "But Miss Hartley said—" Sarah stopped, her eyes going wide. "You've spoken to Miss Hartley." "I have. She claims the Duke was violent with Catherine, that he threatened her, hurt her, possibly pushed her down those stairs." Sarah shook her head so hard her cap nearly came loose. "That's not true, miss. Anna Hartley was dismissed for stealing. We all knew it. She took a silver brush from the Duchess's room and was caught selling it in the village. She swore she was innocent, that the Duke had planted it to get rid of her, but we found the pawn ticket in her own pocket." The room seemed to tilt. "She was actually stealing?" "Yes, miss. And she was furious about being dismissed without references. She swore she'd make His Grace pay for ruining her reputation." Sarah leaned forward urgently. "Miss Whitcombe, I know His Grace seems cold and distant. I know this house feels dark, and the Duchess died in terrible circumstances. But he's not violent. He's not cruel. He's just broken, somehow. Like something in him never learned how to be warm." Elara sat back, her mind reeling. If Sarah was telling the truth, and the girl's earnest fear suggested she was, then Miss Hartley had fabricated everything. The violence, the threats, possibly even the letters. "The letters Catherine supposedly sent to her sister," Elara said slowly. "Did you ever see the Duchess writing letters?" "Oh yes, miss. She wrote to her family constantly, but—" Sarah frowned. "Her sister died 2 years before the Duchess did. Typhoid. The Duchess grieved terribly. She had no one left to write to after that except her mother, who never replied." The final piece clicked into place. Catherine's sister was dead before those letters were supposedly written, which meant either Catherine had been writing to a ghost, further evidence of her deteriorating mental state, or the letters were complete forgeries. "Thank you, Sarah," Elara said quietly. "You've been very helpful. Please don't mention this conversation to anyone, especially not His Grace. I need to handle this carefully." After Sarah returned to her room, Elara sat in the kitchen with Margaret and Mrs. Whitmore, processing everything. "Miss Hartley fabricated evidence," Margaret said slowly. "She's trying to destroy the Duke out of revenge for being dismissed." "It appears so," Elara agreed. "But that doesn't completely exonerate him either. Sarah confirmed he was distant, cold, absent. His emotional neglect may not be violence, but it still contributed to Catherine's deterioration. "What will you do?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. Elara stood, her decision made. "I'm going to confront the Duke. Not with false accusations, but with the truth. All of it. The real truth about his failures and my concerns. And then I'm going to decide whether to marry him based on facts, rather than fear or fantasy." But first, there was one more conversation she needed to have. They returned to the inn where Miss Hartley waited, arriving as dawn broke over the Yorkshire hills. The woman looked up hopefully as they entered, clearly expecting Elara to be horrified and grateful for the warning. Instead, Elara set the forged letters on the table with deliberate care and said, "Catherine's sister died 2 years before these letters were supposedly written. Sarah confirmed you were dismissed for theft, not as part of some conspiracy, and no one at Ravenscroft Hall corroborates your claims of violence." Miss Hartley's face went from hopeful to defensive in an instant. "Sarah is lying to protect herself. They're all lying." "No," Elara interrupted coldly. "You're lying. You fabricated these letters to destroy the Duke because he dismissed you justly for stealing. This is revenge, pure and simple." "He ruined my life." Miss Hartley's composure cracked completely. "I had nothing after he turned me out. No position, no references, no way to survive except taking in washing and mending. Do you know what it's like to go from a position of trust in a noble house to scrubbing other people's dirty linens?" "I know what it's like to face consequences for my choices," Elara replied. "As you should. You stole. You were caught. And instead of accepting responsibility, you've spent 3 years concocting an elaborate revenge scheme that could have destroyed an innocent man and endangered me." "He's not innocent. He's guilty of being emotionally cold and neglectful, not of murder. There's a considerable difference." Elara picked up the forged letters. "I'm taking these, and I'm going to give you a choice. You can leave Yorkshire today, never speak of this again, and I'll ensure you receive enough money to start over somewhere far from here. Or you can continue this vendetta, and I'll go to the magistrate with evidence of your fraud and extortion. Which will it be?" Miss Hartley stared at her with hatred and fear warring in her eyes. Finally, she whispered, "How much money?" "Enough for passage to America and a year's living expenses. More than you deserve, but I'm feeling merciful. I'll take it." "I thought you might." Elara nodded to Mrs. Whitmore, who produced a bank draft she'd prepared before leaving London. The Duke's housekeeper had clearly anticipated this outcome. "You have 24 hours to leave Yorkshire. If I hear you've approached anyone else with this story, the offer is void, and the magistrate gets involved. Understood?" Miss Hartley took the draft with shaking hands and fled the room without another word. Margaret released a breath she'd been holding. "That was extraordinary and slightly terrifying. I'm tired of being manipulated," Elara said. "By society, by gossip, by my own fears. Miss Hartley tried to use my intelligence against me, assumed I'd be so eager for evidence that I'd accept forgeries without proper verification. She was wrong." "What now?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. "Now I go back to London and have a very difficult conversation with my future husband." The return journey felt longer than the trip north, even though the train made good time. Elara rehearsed what she'd say 100 different ways, trying to find the right words to explain what had happened without either absolving the Duke completely or condemning him unfairly. By the time she reached his London townhouse that evening, exhausted and travel-worn, she'd settled on the simplest approach: complete honesty. The Duke met her in his study, his face haggard from lack of sleep. He looked as though he'd aged 10 years in the 3 days since she'd left. "Elara," he said, her given name escaping before he could stop it. Then more formally, "Miss Whitcombe, I didn't expect— Are you all right?" "Sit down," Elara said. "We need to talk." He sat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with white-knuckled tension. "Did you speak to Miss Hartley?" "I did. And to Sarah. And I've discovered several very important truths." Elara remained standing, needing the physical advantage of height for this conversation. "First, Miss Hartley is a liar who fabricated evidence to destroy you out of revenge for being justly dismissed for theft. The letters are forgeries. The accusations are false. You did not threaten or harm Catherine." The Duke's face went slack with shock and relief. "Thank gods. I've been going mad these past days, wondering if somehow I'd done things I couldn't remember. if I'd been more monstrous than I realized. However, Elara continued, cutting off his relief, that doesn't mean you're innocent. You were emotionally absent. You isolated Catherine in a house that terrified her. You failed to get her proper help for her deteriorating mental state until it was too late. Sarah confirmed all of this. So while you didn't push your wife down those stairs, you created the conditions that led her there. The Duke's relief evaporated, replaced by the same haunted guilt she'd seen before. I know. I've never denied that. No, you haven't, which is the only reason I'm still here. Elara finally sat, across from him, close enough to see every flicker of emotion in his dark eyes. I need you to understand something. I'm not marrying you because I believe you're perfect or even particularly good. I'm marrying you because you're honest about your failures and genuinely trying not to repeat them. That's more than most men offer. That's a rather low bar, he said quietly. Yes, but it's a real one. And in my experience, real standards are more valuable than impossible ideals. She leaned forward. So here's what I need from you. Complete transparency moving forward. If I start to show signs of distress like Catherine did, if I become withdrawn or anxious or start behaving in ways that concern you, I need you to act immediately. No waiting, no hoping it will pass. Get me help. Take me away from whatever environment is causing harm. Promise me that. I promise. On my honor and my life. I promise. And I need you to understand that this marriage will be a partnership in every sense. Not you making decisions and me accepting them. Not me managing a household while you manage everything else. True partnership, shared power, shared responsibility, shared decision-making. Yes, whatever you need. Finally, Elara said, I need you to stop punishing yourself for Catherine's death. Not because you're innocent, you're not. But because carrying that guilt like a hair shirt won't help either of us build a functional marriage. Acknowledge your failures, learn from them, and then let yourself move forward. Can you do that? The Duke looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder in his expression. You're extraordinary. Do you know that? So you've said. But I need an answer, not flattery. Yes, he said firmly. I can do that. Or at least, I can try. Some days will be harder than others. Some days will be terrible, Elara agreed. For both of us. Marriage isn't romance and happily ever after. It's work, constant, difficult work. But it's work I'm willing to do if you are. I am. He stood and crossed to where she sat, then did something that surprised her. He knelt, bringing himself to her eye level rather than looming over her. Elara Whitcombe, will you marry me? Not because it's practical or strategic, but because I genuinely believe we can build something worthwhile together if we're both willing to try. It wasn't a romantic proposal. It was better. It was honest. Yes, Elara said. I'll marry you, Adrian Ravenscroft, and we'll either make this work or fail spectacularly trying. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his severe features into something almost warm. I'll take those odds. He took her hand, and for the first time since this entire complicated courtship began, Elara felt something shift into place. Not love, they weren't there yet, might never be. But partnership, understanding, a foundation of honesty that could maybe, possibly, support something stronger over time. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Duke's London townhouse, attended only by immediate family and a handful of close friends. Society gossip raged about the scandal of it all. The second Duchess Ravenscroft marrying the man who'd supposedly killed his first wife. What foolishness! What desperation! How long would she last? Elara ignored every word. She stood beside Adrian in the drawing room where they'd first negotiated their arrangement, wearing a gown of ivory silk that was elegant without being ostentatious. Margaret stood as witness, still worried but supportive. Sir Charles gave her away with an expression of resignation that suggested he'd finally accepted his daughter would never do anything conventionally. When the officiant asked if she took this man as her husband, Elara said, I do, with her eyes open and her mind clear, knowing exactly what she was choosing and why. And when Adrian slipped the heavy gold wedding band onto her finger, his hand steady and sure, she felt not trepidation but determination. They would make this work. not through romantic delusion or naive hope, but through honest partnership and mutual respect. The wedding breakfast was small and awkward, with Elara's mother barely speaking and Adrian's distant relatives eyeing her with suspicion. But Elara found she didn't care. She'd spent her entire life trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for her. Now she was creating her own space, with a partner who valued her mind as much as her bloodline. That evening, they departed for Ravenscroft Hall, not for a romantic honeymoon, but to begin the real work of their marriage. The work of two damaged, complicated people trying to build something functional from honest pieces. As the carriage rolled through the darkening countryside toward Yorkshire, Adrian reached across and took Elara's hand, not possessively, but companionably. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "You?" "Absolutely, but also hopeful." "Is that strange?" "No," Elara said, squeezing his hand. "It's honest. And honest is exactly what we need to be." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Two people bound together not by romantic love, but by something potentially stronger, the choice to face their demons together rather than alone. And as Ravenscroft Hall appeared on the horizon, dark and imposing against the twilight sky, Elara felt not dread, but possibility. This house had been Catherine's prison. But it would be Elara's project, a place to reshape, reimagine, and prove that tragedy didn't have to define a future. She was the Duchess of Ravenscroft now, and she would write her own story in these ancient halls, regardless of what ghosts might whisper in the shadows. The first months at Ravenscroft Hall were harder than Elara had anticipated. The house seemed determined to resist her presence. Pipes froze in the east wing, rain leaked through supposedly repaired sections of roof, and the staff maintained a cautious distance that bordered on hostility. They'd served one duchess who died tragically. They weren't eager to invest emotion in another who might meet a similar fate. Elara met their resistance with systematic determination. Within the first week, she'd reviewed every household account, identified inefficiencies in the supply chains, and implemented changes that saved money without cutting wages. She learned every servant's name and something personal about each. Sarah had 3 younger siblings she supported, the cook Mrs. Davies had a son studying law in Edinburgh. The head groundskeeper, Mr. Pembroke, had worked the estate for 40 years and knew every inch of the land. She didn't try to win their affection. She simply demonstrated competence and fairness, trusting that respect would follow. Adrian watched her work with something between admiration and bewilderment. "You're reorganizing the entire household management system," he observed one evening as they reviewed accounts together in the library, a nightly ritual they'd established. "Your previous system was inefficient," Elara replied, making a notation about the excessive cost of candles. "You were overpaying suppliers and underutilizing staff talents. Mrs. Davies is an excellent cook, but a terrible inventory manager. Sarah has remarkable organizational skills being wasted on basic housekeeping. Simple reassignments and better oversight will improve everything." Catherine never touched the household accounts. Catherine was 17 and untrained. "I'm 26 and educated." Elara looked up from the ledger. "I'm not her, Adrian. I never will be. The sooner everyone in this house accepts that, the better." He studied her face in the firelight. "You're not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "Someone more compliant? Easier to manage." Elara smiled without humor. "Then you proposed to the wrong woman. I told you from the beginning, this is a partnership. That means I have equal say in how this household runs, how the estate operates, and how we live our lives." "I know, and I'm still adjusting to what that actually means in practice." "Adjust faster," Elara suggested, "because I'm just getting started." She was true to her word. Over the following months, she transformed Ravenscroft Hall from a mausoleum of tragic memory into a functional, efficient household. She opened the shuttered rooms, aired out the stale darkness, and filled the halls with light and purpose. She hired new staff to replace those who'd left after Catherine's death, choosing people based on skill rather than deference. And she began hosting, not grand society events, but practical gatherings. She invited local gentry for dinners where conversation focused on estate management and agricultural innovation rather than gossip. She opened the library to scholars researching Yorkshire history, She established a lending program where tenant families could borrow books from the vast Ravenscroft collection. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Letters began arriving from London, some congratulatory, others coldly critical. "Lady Thornbury writes that you're making a spectacle of yourself," Adrian reported one morning, reading the society correspondence while Elara reviewed tenant reports. Apparently a duchess who involves herself in estate business rather than charity work is unseemly and masculine. "Lady Thornbury can go hang," Elara replied without looking up. "Her opinion matters exactly as much as I allow it to, which is not at all. She has considerable influence in London society, and I'm in Yorkshire, where her influence means nothing." Elara finally set down her papers and looked at her husband. "Adrian, I need you to understand something. I don't care about London society's approval. I never did. I care about building something functional and worthwhile here. If that costs me invitations to balls I never wanted to attend anyway, I consider it a fair trade." He was quiet for a moment, then smiled. The genuine warmth she saw more frequently now. "You're remarkable." "Oh, you keep saying that. Eventually you'll have to come up with new compliments." "I could say you're terrifying instead." "More accurate," Elara agreed. "And more useful. Terrifying gets things done." But not everything could be managed through efficiency and determination. 3 months into their marriage, Elara began experiencing the particular symptoms that indicated their marital obligations had achieved their primary purpose. The realization brought not joy, but complicated anxiety. She waited until she was certain, then told Adrian one evening in the library during their usual review session. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, setting down the supply ledger with careful precision. Adrian froze, his pen hovering above the estate map he'd been annotating. "Are you certain?" "Reasonably. I've missed 2 courses and I'm experiencing other symptoms. I'll have the physician confirm, but yes, I'm certain." He set down his pen and stood, crossing to where she sat. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Elara admitted. "Catherine died pregnant. Every medical text I've read details the dozens of ways childbirth can go catastrophically wrong. Yes, I'm terrified. I'll get you the best physicians. Whatever care you need. I don't need coddling, Adrian. I need honesty. What are the actual risks? What happened with Catherine's pregnancy specifically? I need facts, not reassurance." He took a breath. Catherine had difficulty from the beginning. Constant nausea, weakness, fainting spells. The physician said some women simply suffer more than others. Toward the end, she developed swelling in her hands and feet, headaches, vision problems. They called it pregnancy toxemia, said it was dangerous but manageable if she rested. And she didn't rest. She couldn't. The anxiety made her pace constantly, wander the halls. She wouldn't stay still. His grip on her hand tightened. "I should have insisted. Should have what? Locked her in her room?" Elara squeezed back. "Adrian, you can't control everything. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts." "I won't lose you," he said fiercely. "I can't. You won't lose me by panicking." Elara pulled him up to sit beside her on the small sofa. "But you could lose me by suffocating me with overprotection. I need you to trust that I'll tell you if something feels wrong, and I need you to promise you won't treat me like fragile porcelain for the next 6 months." "I can't promise not to worry." "Worry all you want. Just don't let it turn into control." She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "We're doing this together, remember? Partnership. Partnership," he repeated, and something in his voice suggested he was finally beginning to understand what that truly meant. The pregnancy progressed better than either of them dared hope. Elara experienced mild nausea in the early months, but nothing debilitating. She continued managing the household, reviewing accounts, even riding out to inspect tenant farms until the physician gently suggested she might want to limit such activities. "I feel perfectly capable of riding," Elara protested. "I'm sure you do," Dr. Matthews replied diplomatically, "but perhaps walking tours would be equally effective and slightly less risky." Elara conceded the point, though she drew the line at complete bed rest. She continued her work from the library, the parlor, anywhere she could review documents and manage operations without physically exerting herself beyond reason. Adrian watched her like a hawk, trying to hide his anxiety and failing spectacularly. "You're hovering," Elara said one afternoon, looking up from her correspondence to find him standing in the doorway for the third time that hour. "I'm not hovering, I'm passing by." "You've passed by 17 times today. That's hovering." He stepped into the room properly, looking sheepish. "I can't help it. Every time I think about what could go wrong, then stop thinking about what could go wrong and focus on what's going right." Elara set down her pen. "I'm healthy. The baby is growing normally. Dr. Matthews says everything looks perfectly ordinary. Catastrophizing helps no one." Spoken like someone who hasn't watched their first wife die in childbirth. The words hung heavy in the air. Elara rose carefully. She was 6 months along now, her body no longer entirely her own, and crossed to where Adrian stood. "I'm not Catherine," she said firmly. "My pregnancy is different. My constitution is different. My mental state is different. You need to stop waiting for history to repeat itself." "I'm trying." "Try harder." She softened the words by taking his hand. "I know this is difficult for you, but your fear is becoming a cage, and I won't live in another cage. I left one behind in London. I won't build another here." He pulled her into his arms, carefully, always so carefully now, and pressed his face into her hair. "I'm terrified of losing you. Not just because of Catherine, but because I've discovered I quite like being married to you. You challenge me. You improve everything you touch. You've made this house feel alive again. If something happened, nothing's going to happen," Elara interrupted. "But if it does, spiraling into panic beforehand won't prevent it. It will only rob us of whatever time we have." It was morbid reasoning, but it worked. Adrian took a shaky breath and nodded against her shoulder. "Partnership," he murmured. "Partnership," she confirmed. But 6 weeks before her due date, complications arose. Elara woke one morning with a blinding headache and vision so blurred she could barely make out Adrian's face when he leaned over her in concern. "What's wrong?" he demanded. "Headache, bad one, and I can't see properly." She tried to sit up and the room spun violently. "Adrian, something's not right." He was out of the room and shouting for Dr. Matthews before she could say anything else. Within hours, the physician had examined her thoroughly, his expression growing increasingly grave. "It's pregnancy toxemia," he announced, "the same condition the first Duchess experienced. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated, you're retaining excessive fluid, and the vision problems indicate it's affecting your organs." "What's the treatment?" Adrian's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. "Bed rest, restricted diet, careful monitoring, and if it worsens, immediate delivery, regardless of whether the baby is full term." "The baby's only 8 months developed," Elara said, fighting through the pounding in her skull to think clearly. "Early delivery is risky." "Less risky than waiting for you to have a seizure or stroke," Dr. Matthews replied bluntly. "Mrs. Ravenscroft, this is serious. Without proper management, this condition can be fatal." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Elara saw Adrian's face go white, saw him wrestling with memories of Catherine's final weeks. She forced herself to speak calmly. "Then we manage it properly. Tell me exactly what I need to do." The next 4 weeks were torture. Elara was confined to bed, allowed only minimal activity. The headaches came and went in waves. Her vision remained unreliable. She felt her body rebelling against the pregnancy it had accepted so readily before, and the helplessness of it infuriated her. But worse was watching Adrian slowly unravel. He barely slept, spending nights in a chair beside her bed. He refused to leave the house for any reason, delegating all estate business to his steward. He jumped at every sound, interpreted every wince as catastrophe, and looked at her with an expression that expected to see her die at any moment. "You have to stop," Elara told him one night, when the pain had temporarily receded enough for clear thought. "You're destroying yourself." "I can't lose you," he said hoarsely. "Elara, I can't." "Then trust the physician. Trust me. Trust that I'm strong enough to survive this." She reached for his hand. "I need you functional, Adrian. When this baby comes, and it will come one way or another, I need you present and capable, not broken from weeks of terror." "How can you be so calm?" "I'm not calm. I'm terrified. But I refuse to let fear consume the time I have left before delivery." She squeezed his hand hard. "Promise me something, if the worst happens, if I don't survive the birth." Promise me you won't retreat into guilt and isolation like you did with Catherine. Promise me you'll raise our child with warmth and presence and everything you couldn't give her. Don't talk like that. Promise me, she insisted. I need to know that even if I don't make it, our child will have a father who tries. Adrian's face crumpled. I promise. But you're going to survive this. You have to. I intend to, Elara said, but intentions aren't always enough. So I need your promise as insurance. He gave it, though the words seemed torn from somewhere deep and painful. At 8.5 months, Elara's condition worsened dramatically. Her vision deteriorated to near blindness. The headaches became constant, and early one morning she began experiencing seizures. Dr. Matthews made the decision immediately. The baby has to come now. We can't wait any longer. The next hours existed in a haze of pain and fear. Elara was aware of people moving around her, of Adrian's voice somewhere nearby, of pressure and agony that seemed to go on forever. She heard Dr. Matthews giving urgent instructions, heard the midwife responding with professional calm, heard her own voice screaming, though she had no memory of choosing to scream. And then, finally, a different sound cut through everything, a baby's angry, lusty cry. It's a girl, someone announced. Healthy lungs, good color. She's small but fighting. Elara tried to focus her blurred vision on the tiny creature being cleaned and wrapped. A daughter. She'd produced a daughter, not the son everyone expected. Adrian? She managed through dry lips. Is Adrian disappointed? I'm here. His voice came from right beside her, rough with emotion. And I'm not disappointed. She's perfect. Let me see her. They placed the baby in her arms, a tiny, furious creature with dark hair and Ravenscroft eyes. Elara looked down at her daughter and felt something shift fundamentally in her chest. This wasn't just an heir produced through obligation. This was a person, a whole separate person she'd created with her own body. What should we name her? Adrian asked softly. Elara thought of the woman whose tragedy had shadowed this entire marriage. The young duchess who'd never gotten to hold her child, whose mental deterioration and death had left such painful scars. Catherine, she said. We should name her Catherine, not to replace the one who died, but to honor the memory properly, to show that tragedy doesn't have to define everything that comes after. Adrian's breath caught. Are you certain? I am. Elara looked at her husband, this complicated, damaged man who'd somehow become her true partner. Catherine was your first duchess. I'm your second. This child is our chance to build something new from honest pieces. Naming her Catherine acknowledges the past while choosing to move forward anyway. Catherine Elara Ravenscroft, Adrian said, touching the baby's tiny hand with reverent care. After both the women who've changed my life. Over the following weeks, Elara's health gradually improved. The toxemia receded as her body recovered from pregnancy. Her vision cleared. The headaches faded. Dr. Matthews proclaimed it a narrow escape, but a successful one. You're remarkably resilient, Your Grace, he said during his final examination. Many women wouldn't have survived that level of complication. I'm too stubborn to die before I'm finished reshaping this household, Elara replied, making him laugh. But the experience had changed something fundamental between her and Adrian. He'd seen her at her most vulnerable, most endangered, and she'd seen him confront his deepest fears and choose presence over retreat. They'd survived together what had destroyed him the first time. That forge of shared crisis had transformed their practical partnership into something deeper. I think I might love you, Adrian said one evening when baby Catherine was 2 months old. They sat in the library during their usual review session, the baby sleeping peacefully in a nearby cradle. Elara looked up from the estate reports. You think? I'm not certain I know what love is, he admitted. I've never felt it before. But whatever this is, this wanting to hear your thoughts on everything, this finding your presence essential to my happiness, this terror at the thought of losing you, it might be love. That's possibly the least romantic declaration I've ever heard, Elara observed. Would you prefer I lie and claim certainty I don't possess? No. She smiled. Honest confusion is much more valuable than false confidence. And for what it's worth, I think I might love you too, though I'm equally uncertain what that means. Shall we figure it out together? Everything else is a partnership. Why not this? She returned to her reports. But you're still hovering too much when I work. That needs to stop. Love or no love?" He laughed. The genuine, full laugh she heard more frequently now. "Noted. I'll restrict my hovering to reasonable levels. Hovering has no reasonable levels. But I suppose I can tolerate minimal hovering as long as you remain otherwise useful. Your romantic declarations need work too," he pointed out. "I never claimed to be romantic. I claimed to be honest. There's a difference." "Thank the heavens for that," Adrian said. "I don't think I could survive romance. Honesty, I can manage." 6 months after Catherine's birth, London society forced a reckoning. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft were expected to present themselves for the social season, to bring their daughter to be admired, to take their place in society, to demonstrate that the scandalous marriage had produced appropriate results. Elara had no interest in any of it, but Adrian convinced her it was politically necessary. "I have obligations in Parliament," he explained, "and you need to show society that you're not only surviving but thriving. Otherwise, the gossip will continue forever." "Let it continue. I don't care what they think. But our daughter will care eventually. We should give her the option of society acceptance rather than forcing her into my outsider status." The argument was sound, so Elara reluctantly agreed to 1 season in London. They arrived with baby Catherine in May, taking up residence in the London townhouse that had been shuttered during their Yorkshire exile. The first event they attended was Lady Pemberton's ball, one of the season's most prestigious gatherings. Elara dressed carefully in a gown of midnight blue that made her look regal rather than decorative. She wore the Ravenscroft diamonds without apology, and she walked into that ballroom with her head high and her hand on Adrian's arm, daring anyone to challenge her presence. The room went quiet as they entered. Hundreds of eyes turned to assess the scandalous Duchess who'd survived what Catherine could not. Elara felt the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their barely concealed hope that she'd prove as fragile as her predecessor. She smiled and walked further into the room. Lady Thornbury approached first, her expression one of cold assessment. "Your Grace, how unexpected to see you in London. I'd heard you preferred Yorkshire seclusion." I prefer productive work to idle gossip," Elara replied pleasantly. "But duty occasionally requires one's presence in less productive environments." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Lady Thornbury's eyes narrowed. "And how is your daughter? I heard the birth was complicated. Such a risk, given what happened to the first Duchess." "Catherine is thriving, thank you. As am I. Modern medicine and competent care work wonders. Still, you must live in constant fear. They say lightning strikes twice in the same place." "They say many foolish things," Elara countered. "I find it best to ignore superstition in favor of evidence. The evidence suggests I'm perfectly healthy and my marriage is perfectly functional. Whatever anyone chooses to believe beyond that is their concern, not mine." Lady Thornbury opened her mouth to respond, but Margaret materialized at Elara's elbow with perfect timing. "Your Grace, Lord Pemberton was asking about your Yorkshire agricultural initiatives. He's very interested in your crop rotation innovations." Elara excused herself from Lady Thornbury and allowed Margaret to guide her toward a group of men genuinely interested in estate management rather than scandal. Within minutes, she was engaged in a detailed discussion of soil quality and yield optimization, her intelligence and expertise on full display. Adrian watched from across the room, talking with fellow peers but keeping one eye on his wife as she systematically demolished the assumption that she was either fragile or foolish. She was neither. She was formidable, a force of nature barely contained in silk and diamonds. "Your wife is quite something," Lord Hammond observed, following Adrian's gaze. "Not what anyone expected." "No," Adrian agreed. "She's better. Society's still suspicious, you know. Still whispering that you'll destroy her as you supposedly destroyed the first Duchess." "Let them whisper," Adrian said calmly. "Elara doesn't need society's approval any more than I do. She has mine, and that's sufficient." Revolutionary thinking for a duke. Perhaps, but effective nonetheless. By the end of the season, something had shifted. Society hadn't fully accepted Elara. She was too unconventional, too outspoken, too obviously intelligent for comfortable approval. But they respected her. She'd proven herself not just a survivor, but a force to be reckoned with. The Duchess of Ravenscroft wasn't hiding in Yorkshire shame. She was managing a major estate with unprecedented efficiency, raising a healthy daughter, and participating in policy discussions usually reserved for men. She'd redefined what a duchess could be simply by refusing to accept the traditional limitations. The gossip didn't stop entirely. Scandal was too delicious to abandon completely. But it changed in character. Instead of predicting her tragic demise, people now speculated about what unconventional things she'd do next. Elara considered it an improvement. They returned to Ravenscroft Hall in August, both relieved to leave London's suffocating social obligations behind. The Yorkshire estate had become home in a way London never would be. These wild moors, this ancient house, the people who worked the land. This was where Elara had built something real. "I'm done with London seasons," she announced as their carriage rolled up the drive. "One was sufficient to make our political point. Future seasons can proceed without me." "You won't miss society at all?" Adrian asked, though he knew the answer. "I'll miss Margaret, and a few genuine conversations. But the rest, the performance, the judgment, the endless pretense, I'm happy to leave behind." She looked at the hall rising before them. "This is where I belong, where we belong. Building our unconventional life away from prying eyes?" "Exactly." Elara smiled at him, the warm, genuine smile she reserved for private moments. "We've proven we can survive society's scrutiny. Now we can simply live." And they did. Over the following years, Ravenscroft Hall transformed completely under Elara's management. The estate became known for agricultural innovation, fair treatment of tenants, and efficient operations that other nobles studied and attempted to replicate. The household ran smoothly, the finances were impeccable, and the Duke and Duchess worked in genuine partnership on every decision. Catherine grew into a bright, curious child who learned to read at 4 and started asking questions about estate management at 6. Elara taught her daughter everything, not the traditional feminine accomplishments, but real knowledge. Mathematics and science, philosophy and logic, agricultural theory, and practical management. "You're raising her to be ungovernable," Adrian observed one afternoon, watching 6-year-old Catherine argue with the estate steward about crop yields. "I'm raising her to be capable," Elara corrected. "Governability is highly overrated. She's exactly like you. Thank the heavens for that. One of us needs to carry on properly challenging you after I'm gone. You're not going anywhere for many decades yet. Probably not. But when I do, Catherine will be ready to manage everything. No daughter of mine will be helpless." Adrian pulled her close. They'd grown comfortable with casual affection over the years, though neither was particularly demonstrative. "You've changed everything, you know. This house, this estate, me. Everything's better because you refuse to accept limitations." "We changed everything," Elara corrected. "Partnership, remember?" "Partnership," he agreed. 3 years after Catherine's birth, Elara became pregnant again despite her insistence that one dangerous delivery was sufficient. The second pregnancy was easier. No toxemia, no complications, just ordinary discomfort. She delivered a healthy son they named James, giving Adrian his required heir while proving that Catherine's difficult birth had been circumstance rather than pattern. "Now we have options," Elara said, holding her son while Catherine peered at him with scientific curiosity. "Catherine can inherit if she proves most capable. James can inherit if tradition matters more, or they can manage things together. We'll decide based on merit rather than gender." "That's not how succession works," Adrian pointed out. "That's not how it worked before. We're making new rules." Elara looked at her 2 children, the daughter who'd survive anything and the son who'd never know the weight of being the only hope. "They'll both be ready, and they'll both have choices we never did." "Revolutionary," Adrian murmured. "Necessary," Elara countered. Years passed in partnership and honest work. The scandal of their marriage faded into history, replaced by the reality of a functional, successful partnership that defied every expectation. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft became known not for tragedy, but for innovation, not for weakness, but for strength. And when Elara was 45, long past the age when such things typically happened, she received a letter from a young woman in London. The girl was 23, educated, and facing her 7th marriage proposal from men who wanted to own rather than partner with her. She'd heard of the Duchess of Ravenscroft, the woman who'd defied society, built a genuine partnership, and raised children to be capable rather than merely decorative. I don't know if what you have is possible for everyone, Vera, the girl wrote, but your example gives me hope that somewhere, somehow, I might find a similar path. Thank you for proving that women don't have to accept the limitations society imposes. Elara showed the letter to Adrian that evening in their library, where they still conducted business side by side after 20 years of marriage. We've become symbols, she said, slightly bemused. Examples of possibility. Does that bother you? No, it's rather satisfying, actually. We set out to build something functional for ourselves. If it accidentally inspires others to demand more from their own lives, that's a worthwhile side effect. Adrian set down his papers and looked at his wife, this extraordinary woman who'd walked into his darkness and refused to be diminished by it. Do you ever regret it? Choosing this difficult path instead of something easier? Elara considered the question seriously. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been if I'd accepted one of those early proposals. Married some conventional man, produced conventional children, lived a conventional life. But I don't regret refusing that path. This life, difficult as it's been, is mine in a way that conventional existence never would have been. Ours, Adrian corrected. Ours, Elara agreed, taking his hand. Built from honest pieces into something neither of us could have created alone. They sat together as twilight fell over the Yorkshire moors, two people who'd chosen partnership over pretense, honesty over comfort, and built something extraordinary from the wreckage of past failures. In the nursery above, their children slept, Catherine dreaming of estate improvements, James already showing signs of his mother's fierce intelligence. In the village beyond, tenant families lived in well-maintained cottages with fair rents and genuine respect from the Duke's household. In London, society had moved on to newer scandals, but the example of the Ravenscrofts remained, proof that different was possible. We did it, Elara said quietly. Everything we promised in that drawing room 20 years ago, we actually did it. Because you wouldn't accept anything less. Because we both wouldn't accept anything less, she corrected. I was the spark, perhaps, but you were willing to burn. That partnership created everything. Adrian lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of respect that had become their particular intimacy. To another 20 years of honest partnership? To another 20 years, Elara agreed, and whatever comes after. They sat together as darkness fell completely, two souls who'd found each other across an opera house and chosen something radical for their world, equality, honesty, and partnership forged in truth rather than romantic delusion. It wasn't the fairy tale society expected, but it was real, functional, and entirely theirs. And in the end, that was worth more than any amount of conventional approval could ever be. The legacy of Catherine Ravenscroft, both the first and the second, would be daughters raised to demand partnership, sons raised to offer it, and a Yorkshire estate that proved different didn't have to mean broken. Sometimes different meant better. Sometimes defiance created possibility. And sometimes two people brave enough to choose honesty over pretense could build something strong enough to last generations. The wind howled across the moors, but inside Ravenscroft Hall, the lights burned warm and steady, a beacon of what partnership could create when both parties refused to settle for less than genuine respect. And that, Elara thought, as Adrian's hand tightened around hers, was exactly the legacy worth leaving behind.